Our gospel for this Sunday comes from Matthew, the 21st chapter. Jesus said to the people, "Listen to another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard, put a fence around it, dug a winepress in it, and built a watchtower. Then he leased it to his tenants and went to another country. When the harvest time had come, he sent his slaves to the tenants to collect his produce. But the tenants seized his slaves and beat one, killed another, and stoned another. Again, he sent other slaves, more than the first, and they treated them in the same way. Finally, he sent his son to them, saying, 'They will respect my son.' But when the tenants saw the son, they said to themselves, 'This is the heir. Come, let us kill him and get his inheritance.' So they seized him, threw him out of the vineyard, and killed him. Now when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants?" They said to him, "He will put those wretches to a miserable death and lease the vineyard to other tenants who will give him the produce at the harvest time." Jesus said to them, "Have you never read in the scriptures, 'The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone'? This was the Lord's doing, and it is amazing in our eyes. Therefore, I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people that produces the fruits of the kingdom. The one who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, and it will crush anyone on whom it falls." When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parables, they realized that he was speaking about them. They wanted to arrest him, but they feared the crowds because they regarded him as a prophet. This is the gospel of our Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
You may be seated. Thomas, you're my guy for children's time today. Can I come up? Thanks, man. We do want to share, Thomas and I, some it was troubling news, but it's okay now. This morning, Ellie fell down the stairs. So that's why she and Kara aren't here. They went to the emergency room. But the good news, they just got a CAT scan, and she's okay. So that's why it's just you and me, bud. So today is Indigenous Peoples Day. You knew that, right? Yeah. Actually, that's today. It's tomorrow because you have off school. But this is the weekend for that. Yeah. We heard in our scriptures today a bunch of stuff about a vineyard. Do you know what they grow in a vineyard? Grapes. Grapes. Do you like grapes? Yeah. Do you like dried grapes?
No.
Yeah, you're not a big fan of raisins. But that people would. Do you know what wine is made out of? What wine is made out of? Like the wine we have at communion? Grapes, exactly right. You kind of still want some wine. I know. Well, you can have the grape juice, though. Right. Well, not this time. When you're ready for communion, you can have grape juice. Grapes were a big thing where Jesus lived, but they did different stuff. That was a very, very important part of the diet and a very important part of what they did. But people who were living here, who we call indigenous peoples, indigenous to this area, they grew three things together. And I think I can tell you two of them, some of your favorite foods, and I'm wondering if you can guess the third. One is corn. Do you like corn? Yeah. The other one is beans. You like beans? Yeah, okay. You like beans.
The beans that have like the bacon.
Beans with oh, you're talking about when we make the like the baked beans stuff? Yum, yeah. Good Boston kid. All right, so they grew corn because it grew up, and they grew beans because it could kind of like go on the corn. There was one more thing that they grew with those things, and together they called it the Three Sisters. Do you know what that last thing was?
No.
You don't? If you look around the church, you might see one. Look around. Nope, that's not it. Look around a little more. Maybe turn all the way around. What? Say what it is. Candles? Oh, I thought you were actually on it. They did not grow candles. Although maybe, I don't know, maybe they made, what is it? What do you think it is? Pumpkins, or rather squash. But yeah, together those three things would grow perfectly. So one of the main things why we have pumpkins out there and why we get from the Navajo peoples, who were an indigenous peoples, and who are an indigenous peoples here in America, is that they continue to grow pumpkins for us. So I'm glad that we can have those on our altar today as one of the Three Sisters. Okay, you ready to sing our song together? If anybody asks you who I am, who I am, who I am, if
Anybody asks you who I am,
tell them I'm a child of God. Will you join me in prayer? O Lord, may the meditations of my heart and the words of my mouth be acceptable to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. So, world events are causing me to think differently about parts of this sermon, but I'm going to launch anyway with the same gosh darn story that I had planned 48 hours ago, even though all this stuff is planning out. And it's kind of crazy that this is the story I have. So, I went to a stand-up act. And it was this Indian guy, and I mean India from India. We're doing Indigenous People Sunday, but it's not that kind of, okay, from India. He says that he's at the train station, and a guy says to him, I want you to read my holy book, and he's getting proselytized too. And he says back to him, I'd be happy to read your holy book. It sounds great. You know, you should know, though, that I'm Indian. We've got them all already. I'm Hindu. We have all the gods already. And the guy says, really? And he goes, oh yeah, all we do is we just add them to the list, right? That's every single time you get an Indian mystic goes up to the top of the mountain, he comes back down again, and he says, we got a new god. And they say, oh, it's great. Let's pull out the list. Does he have a special vehicle? Yeah, it's a vehicle, it's a horse-drawn carriage, but the carriage is invisible. Yeah, cool, I'll write that down. Does he have any special abilities? Yep, absolutely. He can fly underwater. Oh, that's okay. What's he look like? He's got the head of an elephant and the body of a snake and 100 arms. Awesome. Excited. Put him in the list. And he goes, the weirdest thing happened when suddenly we started having the Muslims come over to India. We would ask them, what do you got for God? And they said, we just got the one. And they said, oh, okay. Let's add him to the list. What's he look like? And I said, you can't look at him. He doesn't have, I can't draw you a picture. That would be inappropriate. And they said, oh, okay. This is kind of strange. And then suddenly, after the Muslims were kind of giving them a hard time with this, suddenly the Christians came. And the Christians said, we're here to save you. And the Hindus are saying to themselves, great. I'm so happy that you're here to save us. We're having a tough time with the Muslims. They said, no, we're here to save you from our God. And I said, okay, who's your God? What's he look like? Oh, he's a white guy with long blonde hair. Does he have any special abilities? Yeah, he walks on water, and if you kill him, he comes back in 3 days. And the Hindus said to the Christians, how do you know that? How did you find that out? And the Christians said, oh, we killed them. And that's when the Hindus knew that this was just a weird scenario. So anyway, this is how the Hindus realized they could not start adding these weird stuff coming out of the Middle East into the list. But I think that there's something really powerful about a couple parts of the story. Number one, we need to save you from our God. I think that this is kind of an indication of some of the places where Christians have gotten it wrong in the past, right? And number two, they were right. We killed our God. We did that. That's the basis for how I think we have to think about these parables that we've read today. Well, let's back up, because there's one thing that I do necessarily want to add, given where we are in the world today. All of the scriptures we read today can be interpreted in one of two possible kind of compounds of meaning, one of which is really concerning and one of which is really liberating. I think virtually every single one of these parables has been interpreted to say, and that is why the land, that is why the people, that is why whatever it is now belongs to us, right? And that is the basis behind so much of the fighting that we're seeing today. It's a kind of exclusion. Sometimes it's called dispensationalism, where we say that there was a dispensation that was for a certain people at a certain time, and that ends. And then a new people come along and claim that it's their sole right to live in that land. their sole right to govern, their sole right to enforce laws, and that everything else before must be discarded. And that includes people. And that line of thinking is going to lead us to ruin, and it has. It's going to lead us to endless ruin. Talking downstairs before coffee hour, getting ready for coffee hour, there is really only one way for us as humans to move forward, and it's to say that we're going to choose to live together. Because we're going to share this planet, we're going to share these lands, and we're going to share space with one another. If we can't agree on that, well, then we've got another alternative, an alternative way of reading these, which is to say that we can be liberated from that cycle. That this way of thinking about being the sole owner of something and through gaining it through violence is exactly how the tenets were thinking in our story today. And that Jesus invites us instead to think differently about how we live in the world, where we live in the world, how we govern in the world, and how we are. So that's something I just need to say given where we are in the world situation right now. And it's probably all the more I'm going to say about that. Because what I want to get to is the parable itself. And oh my gosh, what a parable it is, right? I mean, I hope you guys didn't just hear that and thought to yourself, there is another pleasant story from Jesus. I just love these nice bedtime stories that I can read to my kids about people getting stoned and murdered and cast out and all this sort of great stuff. It's a horrifying parable. It's vicious and violent. It's hard to make sense out of it, so vicious and violent. What's going on here? Well, I would say it's very difficult not to read this in the light of Jesus' crucifixion, right? There's a son who is killed, and Jesus is well aware, in my opinion, of how his ministry is going to play out in the end, and that it will involve, the cross. Jesus knows that his ministry is a ministry of sacrifice, one in which it will take his very life. It's going to cost him his life. So, if we read this in light of the cross, and in light of the fact that the son will always be sacrificed, I think there's a good case to be made that there's a psychological thing going on here. I think that Jesus, knowing and pre-knowing his destiny, has a little bit of PTSD, but I'm going to call it pre-traumatic stress disorder, because post-traumatic stress disorder is what you get after the trauma, and Jesus knows about the trauma before it's happened. So he's experiencing the trauma beforehand. What is PTSD? Well, the P in my pre-TSD is I just explained, but here's the T part. And this is something that some of you know very well, and hearing me say this is going to be 101 or a recap. But it comes out of this place where we go through life with certain expectations about how much awful stuff is going to happen to us, and generally speaking, we keep that on the low end so that we're not walking around with constant anxiety. We don't expect bad things to happen. If you get in your car and you are always expecting a car crash, you'd be sweating the entire time, right? You have to expect that pretty much this will be a routine trip to Market Basket with 0 collisions. And your brain, functioning at that level, is doing fine. What happens is when something so awful happens that your brain can no longer function on a level of risk assessment that aligns with reality and reality's risk assessment, you start to become disconnected. You start to split in two. Your mind might even be able to take control and say, it's very unlikely that I'll get in a car crash. But your body, as the book says, your body keeps the score. Your body remembers how scary it was, whatever this event was, and won't stop worrying. It won't stop gripping you with fear and anxiety. And so you can't talk a person out of PTSD. You can't tell them or just give them a bunch of facts and figures and tell them, no, it's not nearly as risky out there as you thought it was. You can't even, in fact, it's sometimes even unhelpful to do that beforehand, to tell people and equip them with the stats and the figures and how likely or unlikely it is. Because I've sat with people and told them, here's the most likely scenario of what's going to happen in your setup, and I've been wrong. I've been dead wrong. And the worst possible thing that could have happened did happen. It's a very, very bad place to be. You don't want to give people that kind of false hope. But ultimately, here's the problem, and this is where the philosophy of psychology comes in. And usually, psychology is kind of broken into these two camps, one of which is clinical, practical, meaning like you meet somebody with PTSD or any of those things. What are tools we can give them? How do we help? What are therapies and strategies? But the other side is thinking about, well, what's really happening? What really is trauma at an ontological level, where at an existential level, what is trauma? And they're having a very, very difficult time answering that. Because every time you try to answer what trauma is, the answer you get is life. It's just life. And it's something that you have a hard time answering in terms of like what's unique or special about it. All you end up getting is an answer that says it's the world. The world is a fundamentally traumatic place where catastrophically awful things happen and there's no sense to be made out of it. This is what the psychologist Ernest Becker described when he was kind of quoting Otto Rank and saying, honestly, if we study the world and the traumatic nature of the world, what we end up finding, the illogical part of it, isn't that trauma itself, it's our normal day-to-day life. We are living in a constructed fantasy when we think that things are going to be fine. As we go through this world which is so out of control and so dangerous and so vile and violent, it is impossible for us not to recognize that that is the normal status of things. As Becker writes, and Rank before him, it's the normal status of being a creature, an independent entity, a subject, and realizing that external to you is a vast and wild and unpredictable world that can make sudden demands upon you and impose certain things upon you, including violence, including awful traumas, at a capricious rate, whenever it wants to. That's life. That's hard, but that's real. And that's the world that our parable describes. I don't make any sense out of what the tenants think they're doing. The violence that they inflict and the reasons they do it, I can't make heads or tails of it. And I don't believe a single Bible commentator who says that he can, who says that, oh, this trauma here is inflicted with some sort of purpose or reason, or that their reasoning is secure. No, it's not. They're not going to get away with murder. They're not going to convince people that through killing the son, they're suddenly going to inherit the land. That's not how inheritance works, right? This entire world that is crafted in this thing is nonsense. That's the most fundamental part of trauma, is that it makes the world out for what it is, which is just a wild and uncontrolled place. And Jesus acknowledges that. And boy, when I look at the lives that we sometimes lead and when I see the world, that's the world I see out there. I'm sorry if this is a dour note to put into the sermon, but listen, as Lutherans and as theologians of the cross, it's the first and foremost thing we see when we look upon the cross. We see the world as it is, and we're honest about that. We have to be honest about that because I'm not up here to give you some hope that isn't hope, some tools that aren't really tools, a light that's going to blow out when you need it most and you need some illumination. So Jesus, when given this pre-PTSD thing, comes now to the D part, which is the disorder. And again, this is where the philosophy of psychology has a really tough time talking about it, because if this is just honestly the way the world is, can we call it a disorder anymore? Can we say that our interaction with the world is disordered? What's normal, right? In order for this to be disordered, we have to have a baseline that is normal. There is no normal way to cope with a world that broken. What is the disorder here? Well, I'll tell you my answer. My answer is that Jesus has a disordered plan. His plan is to show us first just how broken this world is through this parable, but then he says, I refuse to conform to that. I refuse to acknowledge that as true. I look at this and I will shatter it. And indeed he does. But he does not shatter it in the way that so many people have come to expect, because we're dealing with our trauma. We expect more trauma to fix the trauma. We expect that we're going to pour violence upon violence and suddenly we'll live in a nonviolent world. Huh? That's not going to work that way. You know? That's just not the way the world works. Jesus is planning on something fundamentally different. But before we get there and find out exactly what that is, I do want to say one word about something. When we talk about our traumas, we talk about what happens when we feel these things, there is a question, which is, can somebody self-traumatize? Right? Can you be responsible for the trauma that you're in? On one hand, the answer is absolutely no. And I want to be super clear about this, because something that comes oftentimes with trauma is a turning inward. Again, the eye gazes inward, and people start to assign blame to themselves. And instead of healing, and instead of helping, this just starts the cycle of shame, where the awful thing that happened must somehow have been something that I've done. And that's not fair to you, and that's not fair to the person who's feeling that. And the very point of the cross of Jesus was that the blameless one, Jesus Christ, Son of God, underwent trauma. It's not your fault. That needs to be said so clearly. And on the other hand, too, the sad thing about human beings is that knowing that we have understood and felt this trauma, we somehow find it in our hearts to be a part of hurting other people still. I don't know how we do it, and it is a really sad thing about being a human being. But as the Apostle Paul said, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We somehow find a way to do it. And I think that's also visible in our parable. If the Pharisees were to say that this was about them, if they were to say, hey, wait a minute, you just said that I'm responsible for the killing of John the Baptist. No, I'm not. Herod did that. And indeed, after the crucifixion, they're not going to say, you were responsible for the death of Christ. No, I wasn't. Romans did that. Pontius Pilate cast the sentence, and Roman soldiers put him up there, and the spear in his side was a Roman spear. I'm not culpable. Well, that's the thought process that we all use as human beings when we wouldn't like to take responsibility for our actions. But each of us, in some fractional way and in some interaction, every day, I do believe, find a way to participate in systems of sin or personal sins that do make the world a worse place for somebody and inflict some hurt on somebody. Gosh, Indigenous People Sunday. I mean, right, classic example of diffused responsibility. Nobody ever thought that it was their specific responsibility for what happened to Native peoples, and now they're almost entirely depopulated in New England. I mean, sad. Look, Middle East. What's the answer? What does Jesus have planned? Well, Jesus seems to think that it's not through re-traumatizing that there will be a solution. It's through taking it all upon himself, being the one, the only one, because he is God, who can possibly take all that we're going to heap upon him. Not only the things that have been done to us, also the things that we have done and are going to do to others. He can take all of that and he can die. He can die the death that we couldn't die. He can take the pain that we couldn't take. He can be with us in the places where we feel like we're totally alone. He can walk with us. And in the end, when we experience that terrible realization that this is what life is like, this terrible broken place, he can say, come with me to the other side. Walk with me into the resurrection. Walk with me into new and abundant life. And I will show you a world perfected, free of this harm, where you will be set at ease. My friends, that is good news worth sharing. Amen.